There is a scene in The Wind Rises I would like to talk about. It is the scene where Jiro Horikoshi experiences the Kanto earthquake. It's very interesting how Miyazaki chose to depict the destruction airplanes can bring with a natural disaster. There's the initial destruction the earthquake brings, but the worst of the destruction comes from the fires. These fires consume and burn down large swaths of Tokyo, leaving many homeless and suffering. As the scene progresses, the sounds of the earthquakes have a humanness to them. We hear similar human sounds emanating from a plane in Jiro Horikoshi's dream, too, as it crashes around him. The sounds of the airplane always made me think of how airplanes themselves are human. Jiro Horikoshi's creation is the same as him, as it can be used for good purposes and for bad. He experiences that dream after watching the German secret police chasing down a man. As the film goes on, he realizes Japan is following the same path, taking a nosedive into fascism and heading straight for war. As this plane breaks apart in front of him, Horikoshi is seeing that his dream is out of his control and rapidly heading into complete destruction. He cannot control violence. During the earthquake, Horikoshi sees a similar sight. As fires burn around him, sending ash into the air, he looks up and for a brief second he sees airplanes flying overhead. While he dreams later of the destruction of planes, this image shows him the destruction planes can cause. Earlier, Caproni had shown him a brief glimpse of the devastation planes can bring, but now Horikoshi is experiencing it himself. This film tackles the turbulent times Japan went through in the first half of the 20th century, from rapid modernization through the Depression, the Kanto earthquake, and the fall into nationalism. An earthquake, though, is indifferent to humans, unlike war. Miyazaki is no stranger to themes of nature. They are prevalent in most of his work. In a film like My Neighbor Totoro, nature is healing and beautiful, something that invites you in, while a film like Princess Mononoke depicts the opposite. Nature is at odds with humans and actively fighting against it, while The Wind Rises depicts nature as an indifferent force that arises, but the film has less of humanity's relationship to nature than any of Miyazaki's other works. It is still there, like the difference in scenery between Nahoko's character to Jiro Horikoshi's character. Nahoko paints landscapes while Horikoshi designs planes. The two of them coexist, in fact, they love each other, but nature brings destruction into Nahoko's world nonetheless, while planes fall apart in Horikoshi's world. In this case, the indifference of the earthquake is not too dissimilar to the indifference of planes. Earlier, I stated war is not indifferent, and it seems true, but for the people that actually have to suffer the consequences, it doesn't seem so differential. Japan was hit with massive bombing campaigns that leveled entire cities. Civilian or not, it didn't matter, the bombs would fall anyway. The earthquake foreshadows the destruction Jiro's planes will bring onto the world, something that's completely out of his control. But the government, who thinks they can control these planes as well, and the consequences, find themselves faced with the loss of control as well. Miyazaki's characters tend to have a strong will to live. Horikoshi wants to live as well, but the world he lives in is falling into conflict and violence. He must work at his job if he wants to be with his wife, but his job distracts him from his life. He wants to build airplanes, but the Japanese government does not want them for beautiful reasons. Everything in his life is outside of his control. Interestingly, Horikoshi does not grapple too hard with it. Instead, he just keeps going, living to see his wife and spending what time they have left together. He feels some guilt, and he truly does want his planes not to be used in war. And while it sometimes tears him apart, he just keeps living. When Miyazaki made the movie, he was very interested in how someone could live through those times. He often thought of his father, who built plane parts for the war. Miyazaki had a hard time understanding how his father could be behind the war and at the same time be good to those around him in his daily life. Jiro Horikoshi is similar. He is confronted on occasions whether or not it is his heart or ego he is following, but in the end he still designs one of Japan's most deadly airplanes. But he does not have to contend with the suffering of those airplanes. The movie will periodically cut to scenes of planes flying over what I assume to be China, soaring over burning cities, showing where these planes end up. I like that contrast, the difference between Horikoshi's life and where his planes end up. Caproni even asks essentially if Jiro would rather live in a world with airplanes or without. Horikoshi chooses the world with planes, even at the consequence of what they do. In my eyes, I wish we lived in a world without warplanes, but in a world with planes, governments will use them for war. I do commend the movie for not bringing up the argument, if I didn't do it, someone else would. While it is very much true, it seems to be a way of deflecting guilt. Even if something is inevitable, I don't see why I have to take part in bringing it into fruition. Jiro is more honest because he wanted to build the Zero plane. Even if he didn't want it in war, he still dreamed the design himself. He wanted to make the fastest and most maneuverable plane to push the capability of Japan and bring it to the same standard as the rest of the world's planes. In this sense, Miyazaki saw Jiro Horikoshi as someone who created something Japan could finally be proud of after playing catch up for so many years. Jiro Horikoshi then becomes a symbol for the Japanese nationalists, and making the movie, Miyazaki wanted to take Jiro Horikoshi away from the nationalists and humanize him. Miyazaki believes Jiro Horikoshi did not want more. He wanted to create a different image of him and show planes as beautiful but cursed dreams. In that regard, I really commend the movie for accepting that something can be beautiful but has a dark side. Too often, I think we see the good in an idea or invention or conflict that may have led to some good outcomes and then ignore the suffering that came from it as well because of that good side. Like the airplanes, an achievement in engineering for sure, but we cannot ignore what it has done. Miyazaki understands everything can be used for ill purposes. Though that is where many criticisms of this movie lie, and I honestly believe they are valid and definitely worthy of discussion when speaking of this movie. When you make a movie about the perpetrator, the voice of the victims can be lost. Miyazaki does go out of his way to show what the victims face, but he depicts it in the earthquake scene, which foreshadows what's to come. But does it adequately do the destruction justice? Knowing many of Miyazaki's works, he is obviously not blind to militarism and nationalism. He knows they are destructive things which led his country into war. He speaks from the perspective of a young child who survived the war and grew up to see Japan rebuilt from the ashes. Miyazaki criticizes the Japanese government in The Wind Rises a lot for how war-hungry they are, to a point that Hanjo says they want to bomb everyone at this point. Kastrup does not hold back from mentioning everything Japan was up to before the war, including imperialism in Manchuria and China. I believe Miyazaki wanted to show the destruction through the earthquake, to show these events as horrible no matter what country it happens to. But in the end, since the story is told from Horikoshi's point of view, we only ever see the suffering on the ground level during the earthquake. In other scenes, the destruction is seen from the point of view of airplanes, removing the beauty Miyazaki installed in them early in the film, recontextualizing them as war machines. But we don't see the view of the destruction in China from the point of view of a person living there. Miyazaki doesn't hide that it was wrong for Japan to do these things to other countries. But the story is one from the view of Japan. Those perspectives fall to the wayside. This film was built on focusing on the losing side of the war's perspective. However, these three men are all people that did not want to see the war. Caproni is Italian and Kastrup is German. Both of them are finding trouble in their governments as well as Horikoshi. Miyazaki was trying to figure out how we live when our worlds go into such evil. No piece of art isn't affected by the times it's in. When Miyazaki sets his story in pre-war Japan, he isn't necessarily only talking about pre-war Japan. For one thing, the film is not at all an accurate depiction of Horikoshi's life. It is to capture the feel of the time, not the straightforward historical facts. Usually I don't find movies based on historical figures to be all too good, as they often create a dramatized and often misleading account of what really happened, and distort the real people in the story. But in the case of Miyazaki's The Wind Rises, he does not hide at all that the story is completely fictionalized, and as he treats all his characters as human, I am alright with this story. Though, back to the idea, this film is from the loser's perspective. I want to bring up the ending scene. Caproni remarks when Horikoshi says things fell apart in the end that that's what it means to lose a war. Unfortunately, this can make one walk away from the movie with the thought that Miyazaki is saying that because the war came back to Japan is the reason why the planes are cursed dreams. That isn't the message of the film. The planes were treated as terrible things no matter what city they burned down. But since the film is from Japan's perspective, those things can become lost in it. Miyazaki doesn't shy away from the fact Japan brought the war to itself, putting blame on the Japanese government and military for starting it. However, when one watches this movie, they need to have a good understanding of World War II and the situation that led up to it to fully understand this film. The film depicts Japan when it was the perpetrator, before and how it ended up a victim after. Even with that, though, I still think it is valid to criticize the movie for not showing enough of the victims who had to face the expanding Japan. Scene, we are treated to a visual of planes flying in the sky. They are completely white, like the planes in Horikoshi's dreams, and as they fly, they are engulfed in clouds of smoke. The camera pans down to reveal a B-29 bomber flying over a Japanese city as other planes burn around it. These planes are the fruition of imagination. Their colors are now dull, and they destroy. The camera then settles on a group of refugees watching their city burn to the ground. It's a beautiful visual, and it captures what this film tries to say so well. Dreams fall into darkness. I love how we see the people look on at their city motionless. All they can do now is look, and we can only imagine what they are feeling. Since I did not live through World War II, or any destruction for that matter, I put more trust in Miyazaki to create a shot like this, since he has seen it. The same sentiment of the scene is shown a few minutes later, as Horikoshi watches his Zero planes fly up into the sky as he says, "Not a single one returned." While this is sad and the loss of life from these destroyed planes should be treated with respect, I can see how it can give off the wrong feeling. These planes brought untold levels of destruction. In Horikoshi's eyes, he sees them not as war machines, but the height of his ability. He sees them as ideas. But that is not how the rest of the world saw them. In that way, Horikoshi is like a parent to these planes, or in another way, he sees himself as these planes, forced into this and destroyed because of it. And that way, I understand what the film is going for and wants to show how beautiful dreams turn into nightmares. Japan's achievement became its downfall. We should feel bad that the dream of flight turned out this way. In the end, though, Horikoshi is still seeing off planes that killed thousands of people. So I don't find this film to be bad. In fact, I think the concept and message is really important, and the film is beautiful, and it falls into what Miyazaki wants his stories to be. He has said himself that he doesn't want to make movies that tell people to get killed or to kill. He wants his movies to tell people to live, and that's what The Wind Rises does. Though the way Miyazaki goes about it, well, he makes some interesting choices in trying to capture the duality of planes and people. People can do good things and really bad things. Miyazaki just tells us to be good in our everyday lives. As in a world that is crumbling apart, we should still decide to be good, even if all our systems are based on exploitation and evil. And even in this movie, this is the only instance of an American warplane being shown. Before that, the film had primarily focused on the evil of Japanese warplanes. Miyazaki shows how goodness can sometimes rely on the situation, and how in some situations people can be good, and in other situations they can become violent and angry. This is why I'm quite interested in Miyazaki's new film, How Do You Live, or The Boy and the Heron, as I think Miyazaki will explore the themes of war and nature one last time in a very emotional way. There is still room for stories about how civilians in Japan saw the war. It came to them like an earthquake, as it was not the battles they saw, but just unstoppable death. It rained down from above and destroyed their cities. Everyone who saw it has a story, though at the same time what Japan did to other nations and the people across Asia, they all have their stories too. There needs to be room for that as well. Meanwhile, our world today seems to be swaying too far into nationalism and militarism. Miyazaki wants us to think about that. I say we need to be mindful of our world, to not fall into these things, and maybe this won't happen again.